Hey guys, Will here. Welcome back to another Boosted Media Quick Tips video. So today we're going to be looking at how to overclock or maximize the performance of your Nvidia graphics card. So we're looking at the 10 series and the 20 series here. So the 1050 all the way up to the 2080 Ti. So regardless of which card you have within that range, the software that we're going to be using here and the basic principles are going to be the same. Now this isn't going to be a really detailed guide where we go into, things like thermal paste and water cooling and volt modding and things like that. This is going to be a basic guide for people that just want to maximize the performance out of their card without having to think about it too much. So it should be a set and forget type thing. Going to take you probably about half an hour to 45 minutes to get this done. And once you've done that, you shouldn't ever need to touch it again. So if you're a hardcore overclocker, obviously there are a lot of additional things that you can do. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in a separate guide where we go through all the nitty gritty of that type of thing. But yeah, this video is just going to be a quick guide for people that just want to get up and running as quickly as possible with the best performance without having to think about it too much. So there's a couple of bits of software that you're going to need to do this. The first thing you're going to want to download, and I'll put the links in the description for all of this software, you're going to want to download Msi Afterburner. Now that is the overclocking utility that I like to use. Now you might be thinking, but I don't have an MSI graphics card. That's fine. All of the various different brands, overclocking and tweaking apps all sort of work with each other, so it doesn't really matter which one you use. Now I personally find Msi Afterburner to be probably the easiest to use, the most feature rich, as well as the most stable as well. So that's the reason why I use that. You're also going to want to download Heaven Benchmark and Furmark, two other little utilities there that you can use just to sort of stability test once we've got everything dialed in. So with that all downloaded and installed, let's get into the overclocking. Okay, so this is MSI Afterburner opened up. This is all of our overclocking settings that we're going to be using here to tweak various things. But the first thing we need to do is click on the little sprocket here to open up our options. Just drag that up so you can see the most of it. And you only need to worry about your general settings here. So just click on the general tab. Make sure that synchronized settings for similar graphics processors is enabled. Start with Windows and start minimize so that it loads up when Windows starts. This is a software level overclock. So what happens is if you don't run the software, if you're not running the process in the background, then the card's not going to be overclocked. So you want to make sure that you're running it every time Windows starts, but you don't need to have the console pop up every single time, obviously. So we want to make sure we've got all of our compatibility properties ticked here other than force constant voltage. And we want to have user mode and standard MSI here as well. So that's all fine. Click on OK. So now we have a bunch of sliders here that we can use to tweak various different settings. So we've got our core voltage slider here, a power limit, a temperature limit, a core clock, a memory clock, and a fan speed. Now you can see my fan speed is saying 0. That's because I'm running a water block on my card. So we don't need to worry about that anyway. This is going to always say 0 for me because the water speed is obviously controlled externally. But for you, you don't really need to worry about adjusting your fan profile at all. The basic settings that are built into the card's firmware do a perfectly adequate job of handling that for you. Now a lot of people fall into the trap of thinking if you're overclocking your card, you need to make sure your fans are running at 100% all the time. That's not really the case. These cards are perfectly fine getting up to sort of around that 80, 85 degrees Celsius mark. Anything under that is perfectly fine and safe. So you don't really need to have your fans running maximum speed all the time to get more performance out of the card. It's not really how it works. And that'll all make a lot more sense in just a moment. So first thing we want to do is we want to raise our power limit up to the maximum, which is 122 for most cards. Now you can see when I did that, the temp limit also came up. So you can unlink that. If you're not comfortable running a temperature that high, that's fine. You can lower that. Personally for me, I don't really ever see temperatures over about 50, 55 degrees with the water cooled card anyway. And I'm comfortable with temperatures up to 88 degrees anyway. Anything over 90 is where I start to get a little bit concerned for graphics cards, but that's perfectly fine, 88. So I'm going to leave that at 88 as well. Now our core clock we're not going to touch just yet. Memory clock we're not going to touch either. Now our voltage offset here, this is something that I want to talk about in a little bit of detail. Now with the more recent graphics card, the 10 series and more so the 20 series, there's not really a whole lot to be gained by adjusting this. Now Nvidia themselves say that a 20 series graphics card should last about 5 years at the default voltage settings. If you up that to the maximum that they allow, then that lowers the lifespan to about 1 year. So on a card that costs as much money as these cards do, I generally recommend you don't want to adjust your core voltage here. So leave that set at 0 offset. In reality, what I've found is that generally adjusting this doesn't really yield any sort of a benefit anyway. Maybe a couple of frames, but when you're talking 100 frames per second, an extra 1 or 2 frames per second really isn't going to make a significant difference here anyway. So it's just, in my opinion, not worth the risk of lowering the lifespan of the card. So I'm going to recommend to you guys leave that set at 0. And what we're going to do then is we're going to click on this little 3-bar icon here next to core clock. So we'll click on that guy. And that opens up our voltage and frequency curve here. So this is what we need to explain in a little bit of detail. So rather than running at a fixed clock speed and voltage all the time, the more recent graphics cards from Nvidia have what's called a voltage and frequency curve here. So you can see these are our frequencies and these are our voltages here. So depending on the amount of load or demand that's placed on the card will determine what frequency and voltage the card runs at. And again, this is managed at a driver level. So the card kind of just does this on its own. If you've ever run any sort of monitoring software, you would have seen that often, even running a high-end game, you might only see the graphics card under about 80% load, and therefore the voltage and the clock speed will be a little bit lower. So what it does is it scales the amount of clock speed and voltage that it requires depending on the load. So this is the curve that determines that. So you can see at default settings, 700 millivolts, we're running at 1.4 gigahertz or 1400 megahertz, and that slowly ramps up until we get up to the maximum of 2 gigahertz in this case, or 2.1 gigahertz rather, so 2100 megahertz for the card. And at that frequency, we're running 1250 millivolts or 1.25 volts. So what we want to do now is we want to click on this little button here. It doesn't actually look like a button, but it is. You want to click on OC Scanner. So what we'll do now is we'll click on the scan button. That's going to step through each of the frequencies and voltages and try to maximize the clock speed and voltage for each individual step. So this is essentially what we would be doing if we did a manual overclock, but it's a little bit more precise and a little bit more accurate and faster than doing it manually. And I find that it does a pretty darn good job of it. So we'll click the button. And you can see there, it's given us a little bit of information about where we're starting. Now you can see there, we don't have any over voltage or any memory overclock. And we'll look at memory overclocking in just a minute as well. That's something that we have to do separately manually. But it's really important that you never change more than one thing at a time, because then if something goes wrong, you don't know which thing it was that caused the problem, and it makes it really hard to troubleshoot. So we're gonna start off with our clock frequencies, then we'll look at our memory overclock a little bit later on. So what you can see it's doing here is it's stepping through all the different frequencies. This is gonna take about 15-20 minutes. So you might wanna go grab a coffee or something like that while it's doing it, go to the bathroom, but it's gonna run through each step. You can see there the line's actually moving up a little bit. So what it's doing is it's ramping up the clock speed slowly for each voltage and sort of testing where it thinks the maximum stable level is for each one. So it's gonna go through each step, it'll test all the way through, and then at the end, it'll give us what it thinks is the safe limits. So we'll let that run through now. I'm gonna go grab a coffee. We'll come back when it's done. So the scan has now finished. We can see average overclock is 4 megahertz. Now 4 megahertz is extremely low. It's so low in fact that there would be no real world performance benefit from that whatsoever. Now I am running a OC edition graphics card here, so it's already overclocked from factory, and that's the reason why the additional headroom is so low. But for you guys that are running cards that aren't overclocked from factory, you should see a much higher number there. Somewhere in the vicinity of 50 to 100 megahertz would be what I would expect. Now I know that if I go in and I manually adjust all this and spend hours and hours and hours fine tuning, I can get it to about a 50 megahertz increase over the factory overclock, but obviously that's beyond the scope of this video. If you do want to see more details on that kind of thing, let me know in the comments below and I'll happily do another video where I go into the fine tuning details. But anyway, what we want to do now is we want to click on test, and that's going to run through, and you'll see it step through all the voltages again and just make sure that it's actually stable in the real world at each of those steps. So we finished our test here, and again, we've got a little bit of information that comes up. Our core clock is plus 30 megahertz, so that is at the maximum. So down this area of the graph here, we had a larger overclock than we did in the top, and that's the reason why when we saw 4 megahertz here, that's averaged out over the entire curve. So we are seeing a more significant overclock in the lower portions of the graph, but generally speaking, we're not operating in that range anyway when we're in an actual gaming scenario, so it's not really relevant. But you can see here, test completed, confidence level is 90%, so we can close this off now and close off our editor here as well. So with that all done, you should see curve now under your core clock. That means that it's using the curve that was set by the OC scanner to determine the core frequency boost. Memory clock should still be 0 at this point. And what we want to do is we just want to run a couple of quick tests here just to make absolutely sure that everything's perfectly stable before we move on to the memory clock. As I said before, we never want to change more than one parameter at a time, because that way if something goes wrong, we don't know what caused it, and it just creates a mess of trying to troubleshoot. So what we want to do is we want to click apply, or the little tick sign here. That makes sure that the changes that we've made are committed. Then we want to open up Firmark first. So you should have already installed that. We're going to click on GPU stress test here. I'm going to click go, and you'll see this window pop up. So if there's any problems, you should see little flashes and glitches and visual artifacts happening here. And we're not seeing any of that, so that looks to be all good. I usually let this run for 5 or 6 minutes just initially, just to make sure it's all good. You'll also see you can monitor the temperature here as well. So you can see at the moment my GPU is only sitting at sort of 40 degrees. Remember, again, I am water cooled, so my temperature is going to be a bit lower than yours would be if you're running air cooling. But as long as it's under sort of the 80, 85 degree mark, nothing to really stress about at all. And your fans should ramp up automatically because we haven't made any changes to the fan curve. So I'm satisfied at this point that that's okay, at least for an initial test. So we'll close that off again. And now we're going to do a quick test in Heaven benchmark as well. Now this is a pretty old program now, but it's still good for testing out overclocking for graphics cards, and it is free as well, which is handy. So that's the reason why I recommend this. So we click on run, and you should again see no visual artifacts. Now Heaven, generally, if there's any problems with visual artifact or anything like that, it happens around sort of the lighting. So you'll see sort of these weird looking lens flares and stuff like that, but I don't see any glitches. There's no weird polygons or anything like that happening. So again, we only need to let this run for a couple of seconds at this point, just while we're doing our initial testing. And then once we're pretty confident we've got everything dialed in completely, then we can go and close things off. So if you do have any problems, as I said, you'll either see visual artifacts or you'll see the driver crash or something like that. Now, if the driver does crash, don't worry. It's not likely to cause you any major problems. We'll quit out of this again now. All that's going to happen is it'll restart itself. The drivers these days are pretty good under Windows 10. They're able to sort of just restart themselves if there's a problem. So generally speaking, you don't need to worry too much. And there's no real risk of damaging your card or anything at the levels that we're doing here. Remembering, again, we're not doing any sort of voltage modification at all. So now it's time to move on to our memory overclocking. So for most cards in the 10 series and 20 series range, you should be able to get at least a 500 megahertz overclock here. So we can ramp that straight up to 500 megahertz to begin with. Now for this particular card, I know I can get to around 700. 700-ish is pretty typical for a 2080 Ti. But yeah, start at 500. What I recommend is doing the exact same tests that we've just done before. So run Firmark quickly, run Heaven quickly. And if you don't see any problems, there's no glitches and no driver restarts or crashes, then you can boost it by another 50 or 100 megahertz until you start to see issues and then start backing it off again. So we'll start off at 500. Click apply, run the 2 benchmarks, and then if it's all good, everything passes and there's no issues, crank it up again. So I'm going to go straight to 800 in this case, or maybe even 850, just so I can show you what happens when there is a problem. So we'll click apply here. Straight away, you see all those funny lines and glitches that are showing up on the screen? So that is visual artifacting, and that basically means that we're getting errors. You shouldn't see any of that for yourself if you're just using the automatic overclock. You might see it when you're doing memory overclocking. But just to let you know, that's what happens when you do run into issues. So once you've reached the point on your memory overclock where you can't push any harder without running into issues, what I recommend then, go into a couple of your favorite games and test those out as well to make sure that those are stable. Different games load up the graphics card in different ways. And what I often found is that one game would be absolutely fine, then I'd go and try something else and I'd end up having crashes and problems. F1 2019 in particular for me seems to run into issues long before anything else. I can run most games at higher settings than F1 2019. So just do some testing there. Let the benchmark run for quite some time. Just make sure that everything's fine. I usually let it run for at least 20 minutes before I decide on my final settings. So once you're confident that everything's nice and stable, that is pretty much it. Hopefully you'll never need to touch it again. So there you have it, guys. That is a quick overclocking guide for the GTX 10 series and RTX 20 series graphics cards from Nvidia. So as I mentioned, there is a lot of fine tuning that you can do from here. And I mean, if you're a real enthusiast, sometimes it's enjoyable to actually go in, really fine tune things and get the absolute most out of the card. But look, speaking in terms of realistic expectations, the performance gains from doing that are pretty minimum. It's more sort of the bragging rights and for people that are sort of doing overclocking, benchmarking competitively and things like that. And, you know, if you're just wanting to get the best performance out of your card for your gaming, then, you know, what we've done here today is probably going to be enough for you. And it's something that we can sort of do, set and forget, and never really have to think about it again. So hopefully it's helped you guys out. Leave a comment below. Let me know how you go, what kind of boost you get out of your car. And of course, if you do have any questions, let me know as well. If you guys do want to see sort of more of the fine tuning stuff, let me know as well. I'm happy to do another video later on where we go into that in more detail. But that is it for today, guys. So leave a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video. Make sure you're subbed and hit the notification bell too so you don't miss future videos. And yeah, that is it. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.